feel like sometimes life is really mental.
Dude, that's actually a really good name for a podcast.
No relationship should be the center of your life. I think the best way is to think about how is this relationship making me feel? And I think the biggest tell of like, is it time to leave or not, is how is this relationship impacting the relationship I have with myself?
Hey everyone, welcome to Really Mental, where we want you to know no matter who you are, you're not alone. This week we have a very exciting episode with the Millennial Therapist. And we're really excited to chat today because the Millennial Therapist is also an actual professional when it comes to dealing with some of these topics that she talks about. And it's something we're doing that is new this season. You may have heard it on our episode with Dr. Amen. If you haven't heard that one, go check it out. Getting more professionals onto the show so that we can continue to learn with you. And if you enjoy this episode or learn something, it would really help us out if you consider sharing it to a friend that may need to hear it, and also potentially rating us 5 stars, because that helps us reach more people like yourself that are looking to hear this type of conversation. So we're going to be talking about boundaries, dealing with change, and also how to figure out your values. Harrison, for you, what do boundaries even mean to you, and how do you apply them in your life?
I think it's really interesting because they can get very cloudy, your boundaries. Are you doing them out of fear? Are you doing them because they're genuinely something that you care about? Are you doing them out of all these different things? I think a boundary is you're telling someone a line, and you're putting a line in the sand. You're like, if you cross this line, you risk ruining your relationship with me. You're not telling them that they have to stick with something, or you're not telling them they have to do that, but you're holding your own boundaries. You're holding your own level and your own square. And if someone steps over that, you can, if you want to, leave that relationship because it isn't suiting your best self and what you need. Now, if you're making relation boundaries in a way to like put a box around someone else and control them, that makes it really difficult. And I think we can always fall into that trap where we put our boundaries onto someone else and putting them around us and using them to tell people what we're comfortable with. And I think I've been victim of that and have done that to people in the past, not realizing that that's not healthy and you can't be putting and telling your boundaries on someone else. Instead, you can tell them what you're comfortable with, and if they don't do that, and if they cross that, then you have to make the choice whether you want them in your life or not. That's kind of what I think when I think of boundaries. What about you, Will?
For me, I feel as though what I've realized is that whilst boundaries personally are like, I guess, comfort levels for certain things and your lines that don't want to be crossed, I also have realized that whilst putting those boundaries up, I also need to take the time to understand where the person's coming from. And sometimes I've realized that it's easier for me to like do the thing where like, okay, I'm done. Here's my boundaries, like me or them or like whatever it is. And that puts the other person in a really tough spot too. So that's the really interesting thing with boundaries, is it's like knowing what you're going to stand for and understanding where that's coming from, and sometimes doing the work to heal through that. I'm really excited to welcome the Millennial Therapist, Sarah, our friend, to the show. And we're going to have an amazing chat about boundaries, and she has an incredible platform that she's built off talking around these types of topics. So we're going to welcome her to the show, and let's chat about it.
I'm Sara Kuburic. I am often known as Millennial Therapist. People often don't know my name, actually, which is kind of funny. I'm an existential psychotherapist, researcher, writer, and columnist for USA Today. So that's just a little bit about me.
And can you tell us a little bit about existential psychotherapy? What is that for people who haven't heard of that before?
Yeah, so it's just a particular modality that's rooted in really European philosophy. And it deals with like universal concepts such as death, freedom, responsibility, and meaning in life. We really deal with a lot of identity questions of like, who am I and why I'm here? If I had to boil it down, it would be those 2 questions. And if you are struggling in your relationships, if you're struggling at work, if you're struggling with boundaries, I often find that we can take it back to some of the basics of like, are you taking responsibility? Are you utilizing your freedom? Do you know who you are? And all these things are incredibly important of what is humanity and what it means to be human.
I thought it'd be very interesting to kind of talk about our experiences and kind of share a few things that are very close to home for me right now. Currently at the moment, I am going through a weird phase in a few of my different relationships, and the things are changing, right? And kind of how to manage that change, I'm trying to figure it out, and how to manage whether it's long distance relationships, change in management. It's a few different areas in my life. And I wanted to even just ask Will, you and Sarah, like, how have you guys been able to deal with change, first of all, when it comes to those intimate relationships that you've had for a long time?
For me, I think with navigating change, I think that I spend a lot of time coming back to the things that give me energy, because I find change can be stressful, can be anxiety inducing, because it's uncomfortable to be pushed into it, uncertainty. For me, I like to journal. I like to keep my gratitude journal going, because that helps me focus on some of the things that feel like they're going right. And exercise as well has been super important for me. I would say as well, speaking to the people around me and having mentor figures in my life that are older than me really helps give me perspective on the situation. The thing I realize more as I'm growing up is that we all live in such uncertainty. And I thought that it was a result of my career being in music, and entertainment is, I guess an uncertain industry in itself. But there are no promises for anyone out there. So I just do my best to prepare for the future I want, and expect that there will be twists and turns. Sarah, what do you think are the best ways that people can navigate change in their life?
Yeah, change is difficult because our brain perceives the unknown as a threat and as unsafe. And so it's really difficult for many of us to be super excited about changes, especially changes that we maybe didn't sign up for or didn't anticipate. And so part of that is just understanding that your brain plays tricks on you and is trying to protect you, but in a way that's not serving you, and that your fear or your unease might not actually be matching the situation. But more practically, what helps me is paying attention to what's remaining the same. So I, for example, travel a lot. I've lived as a nomad a lot. And as fun as that sounds, you're also not really anchored. And it can get very disorienting, and it can become very lonely, and it can become very confusing if you do it for extended periods of time. So what I had to realize or look for were consistencies. What can I root in? What is the same? What is reliable in my life? And sometimes the answer is just me. Sometimes that's, the person you're with. Sometimes that's a job. It doesn't really matter. But really paying attention to things that remain the same in your life can be a very grounding experience.
Yeah. And like, how do you do that for yourself? Like, say you don't have anything else that changes the same, like, and you're the only thing that stays the same. In my mind, I'm trying to figure out, like, how do you even do something like that?
Yeah, that was actually my realization when I was traveling, because I was like, the food is different, the people are different, my bed is different, like everything is different. What is the one thing that I take with me that feels familiar? And that was me. And I think part of that was just recognizing that you are there for yourself, that you can be alone and not be lonely, and that you have your own back. So there's a lot of self-trust in that kind of narrative of like, I trust myself to be okay because I have myself. You can have a relationship with yourself that's very tangible. I think we think about relationships as something external, but you can have something called an inner dialogue. You can talk to yourself. You can figure out how you're feeling. You can process your emotions. You can get feedback from your body. Then you can treat your body in the way that it wants to be treated. Like, it's a whole relationship. You can take yourself out on dates. You can have a movie night. You can do whatever. And the thing is, people always assume they know themselves or they're friends with themselves just because they are themselves. And I think that that's kind of a mistake, because you can be a complete stranger with yourself. And so when I'm talking about building that relationship of like, the one consistent is me, it's like I've become my best friend. And I know that if things go wrong, I have my back, and I know that I can rely on the person that I am.
There's so many good points from that. I think what I would like to work on more and encourage the people listening to do is make that a consistent habit of checking in and making the time for yourself, because it is really a skill and a muscle, I think, that helps create space between us and some of like the stresses of change. Where's the line in the middle where it's like, okay, you have a healthy relationship with yourself, but also have that support network.
Of course. I mean, my gosh, we can't do it alone, right? And even if you have those really tough moments where you're like, I have myself, that is not a permanent state in which you can exist or should exist, because we're social creatures and we need people to acknowledge us and appreciate us and love us and support us. And so it's not about the extremes of just being really good with yourself or just being really good with people. As you said, it's like striking that balance of understanding that in order to be good with yourself, you need that sense of community. And in order to be good for your community, you need that sense of self. I am all about getting support, asking for help whenever humanly possible. But when you feel alone, also understanding that you can feel safety in that aloneness.
Yeah. It's very interesting when it comes to being by yourself. How do you, in your experience as well, like how have you been able to kind of get comfortable with being by yourself and sitting in that and not allowing yourself to spiral in that as well?
Who says I don't spiral?
I don't know.
No.
I'm not. Yeah.
No. So what helps me is that I'm an introvert, right? And a pretty extreme introvert in terms of like, I love being alone. I love having intimate conversations, but like I gravitate towards spending a lot of time alone. So that's not a big accomplishment for me, which, you know, with my personality type, it becomes a little easier. I used to feel like I was either missing out or I would start to ruminate about things that were upsetting me when I was alone, or it wouldn't always be a comfortable time, especially if I was going through something really terrible. It's not like I enjoyed being in my own presence. And that's the issue, right? This is when we usually tend to escape ourselves. We go, it's so uncomfortable in here. I want to do something that will distract me from it. But this is really where you have to, you know, we talk about an important skill in any relationship is like navigating conflict or discomfort. And it's also practicing those skills of like, I am really not happy being in my own head, in my own soul, and in my own body. How do we navigate that? How can I resolve that tension? What can I do for myself where I can feel loved and accepted?
Yeah, I love that you mentioned that too at the end about it being a journey, because I feel like there's this pressure of like almost figuring it out straight away. I feel, at least for me. Would you say that when people come to you for therapy sessions, do you find that it's a common theme that people will try and just sort everything out straight away?
Oh my gosh, absolutely. I feel like everyone is so keen to just figure it out. They're like, I want a solution. And I have to disappoint them by saying like, your life is not a problem you solve. It's an experience that you live. And it's the whole, you're broken, now I'm going to fix you. Like, that's not a thing. And I think we need to accept that, or else we're going to be really disappointed by our actions and our quote unquote mistakes. It's super unrealistic for us to have it all together. And I think, you know, there is less stigma now about like mental health journeys and people really working on themselves, as long as it looks neat and they're succeeding at it. But whenever it doesn't look neat and they don't seem like they're succeeding at it, people are not as interested in holding space for them. And so I think as a society, we still have room to grow of like getting rid of those unrealistic expectations and understanding that like this journey is so messy and so ongoing. So pace yourself, accept yourself as you are, even if you want to change.
Yeah. What are some tangible things and like activities that you do in your life that kind of help you not get consumed and actually deal with what you're going through?
So several things. Exercise is a huge one for me. I feel like if I go for a little jog, helps clear the head, helps me be mindful. If I'm in my body, I'm usually not in my mind. And so that's really important as a grounding technique. I started to schedule time to worry about things. So I would go, great. This can be in the back of my mind as I'm doing a podcast or as I'm seeing my clients. So what I'm going to do is tonight, if I really want to stress about it, I'm going to give myself half an hour. I'm going to write lists, or I'm going to cry, or I'm going to just be stressed, and that's fine. And so I started to kind of schedule time to do it, which was really helpful. And then for me, I'm very sensory oriented. So like anything with the senses helps me come back into my body, helps me stop the spiral. And so, a delicious cup of coffee and I'll be there. It's like mindfulness practice, or having, I don't know, cake. I don't so it's just like finding things that will get me back into my body and into my senses, that will kind of stop the spiral. But then also, sometimes the only way to stop the spiral is to actually do something about the problem. And people sometimes try to just cope or escape it, but it's like, if you just answered that email from 4 days ago, you wouldn't need to schedule time to stress about it now.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because I would say something I've observed sometimes the people around me or even myself at times, I've noticed that like it's easier to, identify the problem, but then to make a change and put in place habits that will really adjust how you feel. That can be something that's really difficult. What are some things that people can think about that can help them get to a place to realize that they really have to do this themselves and they have the power?
I think being very, very aware of the responsibility you have for your own life and the freedom of choice that you have for your own life. So I tell people, every single decision that you make either brings you closer to who you want to be and the life you want to live, or further away. And I remember I posted that once on Instagram and someone was like, "Oh my God, that's so exhausting." I was like, life is exhausting, but but it's also empowering, because that means literally everything that you do shapes your life. And that's a beautiful amount of power and control that we have. But that also means that you're responsible literally from like, did you decide to shower? What kind of breakfast did you have? What was your scheduling like? What kind of conversation were you engaging with? And it makes us hyper aware of the life we live. And so I think it's that willingness to go there, but also realizing the beauty of it and the value of doing something like that. So if living a fulfilling life, or a life that's very authentic, is not high on your priorities list, this is just not worth it. And so this whole conversation goes back to like, what do you actually value? And are you willing to put in the work? And you're more likely to put in the work if you actually value mental health, or value taking responsibility, or whatever.
How do you figure out what your values are?
I think sometimes, obviously not always, these are very generalized answers, but it can be as simple as like, what do you really like spending your time doing? So it can be gaming, Instagram, cooking, friends, whatever. Why? What value are you getting out of that? What does it give you, right? So for some, it's connection, it's a sense of belonging, it's creativity, whatever it is. And those things are generally, they speak to what our values are. So most of us can look at our day and break it down of like, what did I actually do today? Why did I choose this job? Why did I choose to have that conversation? Why do I spend 70 million hours on Instagram? And try to learn from your behaviors, because your behaviors will naturally gravitate towards your values, even if you don't really cognitively know what they are.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's very interesting to kind of play with those types of things and have those things come up. And you have to think about it. It's a big thing. It's not like, I think it's a lot of thought that comes into all those different areas. I wanted to go back to nurturing relationships and kind of talking about that. When it comes to your values and your meaning and all those types of things, how does that kind of impact as well with your personal relationships?
I think you'll start to gravitate towards people that have similar values. And I think that there's something wonderful about that. I think sometimes it's hard to discern who is meant to be in your life and who isn't. And having like an understanding of, this person and I share the same value, or your value is going to dictate how you treat people.
Yeah, I think that's really important for people to share. And I think that when you spend the time to go inside and see, I guess, what you feel your purpose is at the moment, I think a lot of other things make sense from there. I sort of sometimes get into a trap of thinking that purpose is this thing that has to be what it originated as. Like when I was like, wow, I really feel I found my purpose. I feel like it grows over time.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. And I feel like you shouldn't be the same person you were 10 years ago, not fully. And so your purpose probably shouldn't either. And it's going to evolve and become more complex, and you're going to have more skills. And when I started off, I was like, I'm going to be a clinician, the end. And now I say 90% of my job is not at the clinic. And so it's really cool, but you also need to be open to it and full circle, be open to change. And when we get so stuck in our purpose, quote unquote, then we can actually miss our actual purpose for that moment. And that's a real thing.
Yeah. When it comes to romantic relationships and navigating them when there is big change, how do you kind of go about that, and what's that look like?
Yeah. So I think it's important to notice how this big change is impacting both individuals. So the more explicit you can be, I think it's very helpful. So it's going, we're about to go through a big change. How are you feeling? How am I feeling? The only way to navigate successfully through change is to do it in a very safe way. What I mean is the safety needs to remain in the relationship, right? And if you have safety and trust and open communication and honesty and a mutual goal, which are all things we need in any healthy relationship, you're better off navigating the change. And if you don't have those things, you're going to have a harder time.
No, that definitely makes sense. I think that for us, I wanted to say, throughout like our journey and throughout different things with different people and our relationships with them, when you have a loved one and you have someone you really care about and you're trying to build those skills with them, how do you build those skills while you're apart and you're not physically together with them, or they're across the other side of the world and you're trying to do these kind of things and continue a relationship during that?
Oh my gosh, it's so hard. Long distance is really hard. I remember doing it through college. I've actually done it several times in my life. And it's a different type of relationship. I think that's what people need to understand. It's like the relationship that you had prior to that no longer exists, and not in like a dramatic way, but like it's going to be a different structure of a relationship. You're probably going to maybe have increased emotional intimacy and maybe decrease in sexual intimacy. Maybe you're going to, it really depends. And it also depends what your goal is for your time apart. So the ones that were successful for me, a lot of the time it was like, we're committed, but we're also going to be really committed to growing as people while we're apart. Because as much as relationships are great, they can also kind of detract from some things or make your life more busy. And so it's kind of really leaning into the like, we're really going to focus on our careers, or we're really going to focus on our jobs, and we're still going to put in a ton of effort in this relationship, but we're going to make the time apart meaningful. Instead of feeling like you're putting your life on pause until you see them like a year or 6 months or 2 years from now, that feels like a wasted time. And that's something you don't want to do, because then you get resentful, you get sad, you get depressed, you start fighting. So you want to find ways at this time how it's going to benefit both of you.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful advice. And I think relationships become so complex when there are those extra variables. How do people make the decision to be like, yes, this is worth the investment of time?
No relationship should be the center of your life, right? I think the best way is to think about, how is this relationship making me feel 90% of the time? Of course, we all have like 10% that might be a bit crappy, but like your ratio shouldn't be 50-50. Like 50, it's great, 50, it's bad. That's like the roller coaster relationship, which is super hard for your nervous system. But it's like, overall, where am I at here? Like, how's the relationship make me feel? Now, if you're in an abusive relationship and they're great 10%, 90%, and then really abusive 10%, that ratio doesn't work, of course. And I think the biggest tell of like, is it time to leave or not, is how is this relationship impacting the relationship I have with myself? And so if the relationship is, if you're feeling like you're shape-shifting or editing for the other person, like you're going to do long distance and you really don't feel like that's the right thing for you, or whatever it is, or that's going to impact your own mental health, I think it's really, really important at the end of the day to go, how is this relationship impacting my relationship with myself?
Yeah, and whilst you're saying those things, I wanted to just like ask where a few of these different areas sit in. Where does compromise sit in with this? Where does boundaries sit in with this versus unhealthy relationships?
Compromise. I think we should compromise on things, not on who we are. I don't think compromise is the best policy at all times, because then you have two miserable people. Neither one is getting what they want. It's like, why didn't that work? We compromised. Yeah, because neither one of you got what you wanted. I'm not really sure what it achieved. except making both people very miserable. Now, if one person compromises and the other doesn't, then you have a one-sided relationship, the power dynamic is off, and that also doesn't work. So I think compromise is fine when it comes to like maybe immediate or like if it's temporary needs, or if it's wants, if it's desires. But if it's like permanent needs, if it's like who you are as a human being, if it's your values, if it's your beliefs, I'm not so hot in promoting compromise. And I guess that's where boundaries come in. I think boundaries are a blueprint. You're literally saying, okay, here's a wall. You cannot come through here. Here's a door. You're welcome. It's open. Come in and out as much as you please. Here's a window. If you want to squeeze once in a while, fine, come on in. Here is me telling you how to make this relationship work. I want it to work. And for it to be successful, this is what you need to do. And then what people forget, though, is you can't just be like, here are boundaries. You have to then take their boundaries and read their blueprint, right? It's a reciprocal action. And you need to see, like, do they match up? Incompatibility in boundaries is a real thing. And if your boundaries are not compatible, that can be a reason enough to sometimes end a relationship. It's a very serious thing, but it's not like a threat. Like, I think about it, you have a car and it takes gasoline, not diesel.
I love that you mentioned sort of the blueprints, and I think as well that's the interesting balance with compromise, because I guess there's certain boundaries that are non-negotiables and ones that, as you were saying, you know, there is some wiggle room with them. When it comes to, I guess, figuring out what your boundaries are, what are the ways that you can sort of figure out your boundaries?
It is contextual. I love that you brought that up. It's not one size fits all. And it's also not like I read this boundary in a book or an Instagram post and now I'm just going to go wild with it. Like sometimes it's just so inappropriate. Like it makes no sense. But for boundaries to be effective, they have to be rooted in who you are and what you value, and like why there has to be a reason for why you're doing it, or else it's completely meaningless, or it becomes a part of manipulation, right? Like you're just doing it to alter the other human being. So it's like you just need to be really attuned of like, how's this context making me feel? What do I not want to allow in my life? What am I okay to compromise on in my life? Okay, what does the boundary look like? And the identity piece actually has a lot to do with it, of how you understand yourself and who you are in that moment is huge.
When it comes to boundaries, like for yourself, and when you're figuring out your boundaries, how do you not allow yourself to base your boundaries off fear?
For sure. I mean, that's a control thing, right? I mean, if I were to strip down all the like fluffy language, that's a way to dampen or alleviate our insecurity and our fear by controlling the other person. Is it because this person's now away somewhere, so that's why? Or is it like in your everyday life that was always the contract? Why is the contract changing? And so if you think it's an insecurity thing, I think a more fair thing to do instead of set up boundaries to go, I'm feeling incredibly insecure right now, or I'm feeling really scared right now, and these behaviors are worrying me because I think the worst case is going to happen. How can we deal with this together? Are you happy to compromise on some of this? Because going in hot with a boundary is being like, you're not allowed to drink, you're not allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do this, and I want you to dress from head to toe, covered. Like, you know, it's like, that's so inappropriate. A lot of people are misusing boundaries and hiding a lot of fears behind boundaries. And so I think a healthier thing to do is just go, I'm really scared. Here are behaviors that I think would trigger me. How can we deal with this together?
I like that. So it's like a partnership and something that you're going through together. That makes sense. And I always feel like if it's something that you don't have much control over, then I always tend to question, is that like, seeking control, or is that like a manipulative thing to do? I think it's more like focusing on how we react to the situation if someone does do that, because we have no control over if they go out and, I don't know, let's say, continue with the metaphor, go and drink with guy friends or whatever.
I personally wouldn't ever classify manipulation as good.
Yeah.
Control, however, is something most of us need for a sense of safety. And so that's really working with your relationship, the ability to surrender, the ability to trust the world around you, the people around you, and that you're going to be okay even if you can't control every single element of your life, that there is like this inherent trust in the world and your community, right? So control is a tough one. I don't think it's necessarily bad. I think we all need a sense of control. I just think, how you get it. Is it through structure? Is it through a routine? Is it through self-awareness? Or is it through trying to change other people and, manipulate actions and whatever? So I don't think control is necessarily inherently bad. We all yearn it. It's just how you try to get a sense of safety in your life. Is that what matters?
Yeah, and I wanted to just ask you, going back into nurturing that relationship with yourself and kind of back into the conversation that we were talking about when it comes to boundaries, all those different types of things. How do you can you set boundaries with yourself?
Yeah, I think those are the hardest boundaries to keep. I think we're sometimes so disrespectful of our own boundaries, but that looks like after 7 p.m., I'm not going to answer work emails. Like, I, will not say yes to something that I don't want to do. I am going to, like, it's just giving yourself a blueprint of like, this is what I think you need for us to be good and for your mental health not to suffer and for you to thrive in different areas of your life. So here are some boundaries for you. And so self boundaries are a very real thing. We just often don't do them. It's like, I'm not going to text my ex when I'm drunk. Like, it's a boundary. But
Yeah.
there you are in the morning and you're like, crap. Like the amount of times I've heard people talk about that, it's just because we don't respect our boundaries enough usually.
Yeah, I think that's really solid advice and really helpful as well for all of us navigating these things.
So I really love that episode with Sarah, Millennial Therapist, today, talking about a bunch of different areas. I thought the topic on boundaries was really interesting, and especially talking about how we have the relationships in our life and how meaningful they are to us. What was your biggest takeaway, Will?
I feel as though embracing change is really important, and change within relationships and life. I love that Sarah touched on the fact that life isn't a problem to solve. It's an experience that you live. And in the context of all of these complex, topics we covered, I feel as though that's important to remember because it is easy to sort of get caught up in trying to fix things. It's important to have the space and be like, you know what, this is how it is today. It's not perfect. I don't have the perfect relationships, or maybe I'm not at the place I want to be, but that's fine because I'm taking each day as it comes and working towards that. I also like that we touched on the fact that your purpose, can change and grow. And I think that's so true. And being open to that and flexible is really important because when it comes to our direction in life, I feel as though that gives us a lot of the fuel to then have strong relationships, know our worth. And so when it comes to our own purpose and mission, understanding that can change and go in waves is really important, and it can be fluid. And I just wanted to mention that if you enjoyed this conversation, thank you for sticking around and listening to it. And if you think a friend of yours may like it, please consider sharing it with them and rating this podcast 5 stars so that we can reach more beautiful people like you. And we have another amazing guest coming next week. So we will see you then on Sunday, releasing episodes every Sunday. And yeah, be sure to follow us on our socials at Really Mental Podcast so that you don't miss anything in between that time. Thanks, everyone.